I will be speaking in English today. I'm sorry, my Finnish is very, very limited. But I was just reminded of, I've taught in different countries, so I've gotten used to working with translators. But the funniest experience I had was in South America, where I was teaching or assisting in a school, and I was preparing a marionette show to do for the children, and one of the teachers was going to read the story in Spanish while I did it in English. And so we were rehearsing, and I know a little bit of Spanish, more than Finnish, but not much. And I'm performing, and I'm waiting for certain words to come, and they weren't coming, and then I listened more carefully, and I realized she was reading a completely different story than I was acting out. But fortunately, we straightened that out before the actual performance. It was still the rehearsal. Yes, well, it's great to be here. I've been in Finland a couple times before, and each time I find myself feeling more at home here and loving the nature and just the way of life. It's great. Love sitting down by the sea and thinking good thoughts about the course and now about today. A little bit about myself. So I started working with young children a long time ago, in 1971. I was still in my 20s at the time. I really knew nothing about children, and so I had to learn a lot from the children. My two colleagues with whom I started a kindergarten knew a little more than I did, but not a lot more. So we were all kind of learning as we went. And we didn't know anything about Waldorf education at the time. We just knew that there was a spark of spirit in every human being, and there was a way to educate that would keep that alive. That was our central thought in starting a kindergarten. This was in Baltimore, Maryland, on the East Coast of the United States. I now live about an hour south of that, closer to Washington, D.C., our capital. And then, fortunately, we learned about Waldorf shortly after we began, and so we started to do things from Waldorf education with the children, and everything we did from Waldorf, they just opened to so widely, much more than anything else we were doing. So then I had to find out what was behind all of this, and that's what really led me in deeper. Meanwhile, my two colleagues went off and did other things and kind of left me with the kindergarten. And there were times when I thought, this is too much. This is the hardest work I've ever done in my life. I can't go on doing this anymore. And then I sometimes thought, well, you know, Joan, one day you'll retire, and then you can rest, right? And so that comforted me for a while. But then I was meeting these great Waldorf educators who were in their 70s and 80s, and they were still very active. And I thought, oh, I see, in Waldorf education, you never really retire. Well, one day I'll die, and then I'll have a good rest. Then I got deeper into anthroposophy, and I realized, oh my gosh, the work just begins after you die. So I've tried to build in little vacations and rests as I go so that I could keep going. I really loved being a Waldorf teacher. I have to say, I probably would still be in the classroom today, except that something else really started to call to me. And you perhaps all have had this experience when there's something inner that just won't let you alone and keeps saying, you need to do this, you need to do this. And this for me was that I needed to do something outside of Waldorf education for the children that I saw who were really suffering, I would say, from modern life. These were not particularly the children suffering from poverty and abuse, though it included many of those children. But in the States, it's very difficult now to be a child, and especially a young child. The world is not, it's not set up to support the healthy development of children. It places a lot of demands on children, expectations that are not realistic, and then immerses children in long hours of media, cuts them off from nature, takes them away from play, does all sorts of things that you just feel the children are not thriving. And in fact, the data, the statistics show that the children are not thriving. We now have millions of children on medications for psychological and behavioral difficulties like attention disorders and hyperactivity, things of this nature, that were not much of a problem in the past. And when I started teaching, probably all through the 70s, maybe I had one child who showed signs of hyperactivity, you know, and now it's a fairly common thing in the States. Children have very little rhythm in their life. They have far too much media. They don't have enough movement. They don't have enough time out in nature, and it affects them very much. And there are ways to restore their health without resorting to drugs, but most people don't know about those things, or they find it too difficult to change the way the families function and the way the schools function. So I was seeing more and more problems all through, especially the 1990s, and something in me just said, you need to work on this. It's not enough right now just to work with the children who are in your class, or even with Waldorf on a bigger scale, because I was working internationally. You need to do something. And it felt huge. I had really no idea what to do. But I started talking to others, to non-Waldorf educators in universities, to doctors and therapists of all kinds. And I found that many people were seeing the same problems in childhood that I was seeing. And they were doing their best for the children that were in their care. And we thought, perhaps if we work together, especially people from the medical world and from the educational world, which are two worlds that rarely work together. Perhaps if we work together, we can make a difference. We can bring these problems more to public attention and start to build up some solutions for the problems. And so we founded the Alliance for Childhood. It was founded here in Europe, and it was founded in the United States, and since then it's been founded in Brazil. Those are the most active places. There are alliance efforts in other parts of the world. And the Alliance for Childhood works broadly on supporting healthy childhood for all children. I would say healthy and creative childhood. And tries to counteract this decline in children's health and well-being that we're seeing. I think it's not as pronounced here in Finland and in the Nordic countries from what I can tell, but it's very pronounced in the US and in the UK and in other parts of the world. And all of us in the US, we look to Finland as our great example. It may not feel like you're in paradise here, but from our perspective, you are in paradise when it comes to raising and educating children, that you have still a great deal of wisdom, and it's not just an individual wisdom, but it's in your policies and your practices. And I would speak for many of my colleagues in the US and say, I hope you will protect what you have here and even extend it so that it can continue to serve as an example. I just this morning had an email from a university that I know that's hosting a conference on the Nordic experience of childhood. You know, so in the US, people look very much to the Nordic experience. Within the Alliance, and then I served as its director until fairly recently when I retired from that position. I do still have dreams of retirement, but it doesn't ever quite seem to work out for me. But so now I'm back in again as a consultant. But within the Alliance, we've worked on two major issues. The one is the overuse of technology in childhood, and the other is the absence of play in childhood. So we work in a general way on the conditions of childhood, but we always also work in a practical way on certain issues. We publish articles and reports. We have a website that is out of date, but nonetheless has a lot of good content on it. It's being revised at the moment, and that's Alliance for Childhood, all one word. .org. And under publications, you'll find a number of publications about play and about technology. And I remember when we started, with a $500 gift from the Waldorf Kindergarten Association in North America. And people said to me, what are you going to do with $500? That's not much money to start an organization with. And I said, well, I think I'll take people out for breakfast and talk with them, breakfast being the cheapest meal you can take somebody out for. So I had a number of good breakfast meetings with different, what we call thought leaders, people who were influential in childhood issues. And one of them was a man who was working on technology issues, the overuse of computers, especially in schools. So this is back in 2000, 2001. We already had this as a major issue in the States. And I remember in one of our breakfasts, he said to me, well, what you need to do, Joan, is have a very limited, defined focus for your alliance. He said, it'll never work if you think you can change the whole world. And I thought, uh-oh, I think I'm in trouble because I won't be satisfied until we change the whole world. And meanwhile, his group is out of business and the alliance is still going while it tries to change the whole world when it comes to the view of children and how they're educated and raised. With technology, and we can come back to this later, but in the States now, children who are, let's say, between 2 and 8 of years of age, they are watching anywhere from 2 to 4 hours a day of screen time. That could be television, videos, and computers. This is outside of school, 2 to 4 hours a day, depending on which study you look at. And children and youth who are ages 8 to 18 spend 7 hours a day watching screens. They also have music, and other things, but specifically watching screens 7 hours a day outside of school time. And then many hours within schools. Many of our schools give youngsters tablets or computers so that they use them all day, basically. My own town where I live, it's a university town, and the university and the town work together to create a public school, but what we call a charter school that has its own kind of curriculum. And they signed on to some program. And when I read the documentation for that program, it relies heavily on computers. And in high school, it says the students spend 80 to 90% of their time on computers. So the school in my town doesn't yet have the high school. The kids are not spending that much time yet. But people find that a very desirable goal, despite the fact that we've had computers now for a good 20 years in our schools, have spent billions of dollars on them, and are not seeing particularly good results from it. Our test scores have not improved, and by no measure can anybody say that our schools are better now than they were 20 years ago. And I'm sure you all know about the PISA test that's given to 15-year-olds through OECD. And what the head of that test says is that when he visits classrooms in the countries that score highest on the PISA test, and what he sees in that classroom is that there's generally relatively little computer use, but a real emphasis on good quality teaching, and that's what makes the difference. But the US tends to go in a different direction and is putting a lot of reliance on technology in schools, including for ever younger children, 4 or 5-year-old children. We have these big screens are called whiteboards, and the teachers are taught to use them. So if I had a whiteboard here instead of a blackboard, everything I say, I would have slides or pictures, and you would get to be completely distracted looking at that instead of at me. What happens if you've been at lectures where there's PowerPoints that are on all the time is that you actually don't build up much of a connection to the speaker. Your eyes are always over there. So when I do use a PowerPoint, I use it just for part of a talk. Not using it at all today, but if you ever have to do one, my advice is talk and connect with people, and then show some pictures or some slides, and then go connect again. People still like to be connected, actually, live and in person. And in fact, a friend of mine who's a researcher about play did a study where she and her colleagues interviewed about 80 children, ages 3 to 18, out in California. And the big question they asked them was, if you could design your favorite day of play, what would it be? Now, many of these children spend hours a day on technology of some sort. But in their answers about play, very few of them mentioned technology. All of them said they wanted to be outside playing with their friends. So even in this day and age when we think children are so excited and enamored of technology, if you actually give them a chance to be outdoors with friends, that's what they want. And when I mentioned this to a woman from Singapore, she said she had done a similar study with 5 and 6-year-olds, and they had the same answers, even though all of them had the digital technology at home. They wanted to be with friends outdoors. And Waldorf students tend to be lucky that way. They get to spend time outdoors with their friends, and both at school and I hope also at home. So let me just talk a little bit about the States and what we're seeing there, and then I would love to hear from you a little more what you're experiencing here in Finland. So when I grew up, and that was back in the 1940s and 50s, it was very common for parents to say, just go out and play and don't come home till supper. They just didn't even want to see us, right? They wanted us out. And I never, now I look back and I think, what were we supposed to do for lunch? I'm not quite sure on a Saturday, but somebody would feed us along the way. And so we spent a lot of time playing. That was just what you did. There was television, but there wasn't anything terribly interesting on television, and we were much more interested in being outside with our friends. So play was the main thing of our childhood, not just in early childhood, but all the way through. Yes, we went to school, we tolerated that. I liked school pretty well, but play was really what it was all about. And now, children, it's like play, it hasn't completely disappeared, but it keeps getting smaller and smaller as a part of children's life. And by play, I mean when children get to have their own ideas and tell their own stories and direct it themselves, not when an adult is telling them what to do or setting the rules for them. Whether it's a 3-year-old who's playing with objects around or a 10-year-old who's got an elaborate plan with his or her friends that they carry out over days and weeks, it belongs to the children. Play does not belong to the grown-ups. We're allowed to play too. In fact, it's good for us to play, but it's not good for us to direct the children's play. Play belongs to them. Their play belongs to them. We can participate. Often they invite us in, but then we have to be very careful because we're an invited guest. We don't take over their play. So it keeps shrinking, and we have data in the States that shows shockingly small amounts of time when children play. So for instance, one area where it has shrunk a lot is in early education. It used to be that our kindergartens, and in the States, often children are age divided. So we have preschool for 3 and 4-year-olds, and we have kindergarten for 5-year-olds, and children mostly start school around 6, basically a year ahead of when you start. In Waldorf schools, it's maybe 6 months ahead of when you start. But putting that aside for the moment, so it used to be that most of the kindergarten morning, it was a half-day program, was devoted to play and experiential learning, meaning hands-on things. And now most of the day, it's usually a full day till 3 o'clock, is devoted to reading, writing, and arithmetic, and some science, and maybe a little bit of social studies, family life, whatever. There was no data on the changes in kindergarten. There have been vast changes since the 1980s, but nobody recorded it, nobody studied it. And so the Alliance for Childhood raised some money some years ago, and we commissioned 3 studies, actually. 2 of them were quantitative, statistical studies, and 1 had people going into classrooms to observe. But the quantitative ones were questionnaires for teachers in New York and in Los Angeles, and the results were almost identical. So these were all-day kindergartens, let's say from 9 to 3. 90 minutes a day was spent on writing and reading, 60 minutes a day on math, 20 to 30 minutes a day on testing or preparing children for tests. Now, these are 5-year-olds we're talking about. 20 to 30 minutes a day for either giving tests or preparing children to take tests. I can say more about that in a moment. And less than 30 minutes a day for play. So that, we did a report, you can find it on our website, called Crisis in the Kindergarten, Why Children Need to Play in School. And that's been widely used across the country, cited in many other people's reports and studies. It's probably the most significant piece of work we've done. In part because there was nothing. Here we'd gone through all these changes in kindergartens, and no one had studied it until we did. Now there's an additional report from the University of Virginia that looks at data and basically affirms what we had found using some national data. And in fact cites our report right at the beginning of their report. So within early education, there's been this tremendous change. And I first witnessed it already back in the 1970s. I was still teaching in Baltimore. And one of the children from my class went on to a public school for kindergarten. And her mother had said she was sending the child to her neighborhood school because they were doing some new things that she thought her daughter would really like, but she couldn't really describe it to me. So then I got an invitation to visit this public school that was doing new things, and I thought, oh, I'd like to see what they're doing. And so I went, and they were doing 2 new things. One was they were, for the elementary school, they were using what was called open classrooms, where they basically knocked down walls between classrooms, and they would have 120 children together in one big space with 4 teachers. Yes, many of you look shocked. I thought it was the most ridiculous thing I'd ever heard of. And in fact, I was at that time attending weekly meetings to plan a new public school that was going to be near our Waldorf school. And we were having very good meetings, very creative people were engaged in this process. And then the Department of Education began bringing in its experts to convince us that open classrooms was the way to go. And right away we said to them, this is ridiculous, this will never work, don't do it. And it became clear week after week when they brought more experts and more experts in that they were committed to this. And whatever we had to say was just, we were just I don't know what you'd call it, we were like the showpiece. We were supposed to be planning the school, but really they already knew what they wanted. So we disbanded that committee, but now I was in a school that had knocked down walls, had 120 children in a space, and it was just so evident this would never work. Anyone that knew children would know it wouldn't work. And in fact, in schools across the country that had done it, pretty soon they were putting the walls back up again or moving file cabinets and shelves and whatever they could move to try to divide up the space because it didn't work. And we got away from all of that. But the other big change that they had done was in the kindergarten. And I went in and there was the little girl who'd been in my class, and she was sitting on the rug with her teacher in front of a blackboard with words and letters, and a little group of them was working on that. And another group was working on words and letters in a different way over here, and another group over here. And there were these beautiful, old, thick wooden shelves that I coveted. I wanted those shelves for my kindergarten. You can't get wood like that anymore. But they were empty. They were completely empty. There were no toys visible in this kindergarten. No building blocks, no dolls, no animals, no dress-ups know nothing, just all these learning materials. And I comforted myself thinking, oh, I see that door over there. That must be a big closet. That's where they have the toys. At some point, the children will be allowed to get the toys. And so finally, the teacher said, okay, children, you can put away all your materials, and it's free time. And I thought, whew, now out will come the toys. No, free time meant the children went and got worksheets, and then they would sit down, and these worksheets had letters, and you would circle the matching letter, right? If they ever got out any toys, if there were any toys, I never saw them. It was just, for me, a complete nightmare. And completely unexpected. That was the first time I had even had a hint that you could have a kindergarten that had no toys, where all these 5-year-olds did the whole morning was move from one kind of learning experience to another, learning in this way, not learning through play. And so for a while, that was an isolated incident. But by the 1980s, we were having more and more of this in our kindergartens. It went through a certain progression where initially our kindergartens were a lot like Waldorf kindergartens in that, you know, you had building materials over here. They were blocks and not logs and stones and things, but there were building materials, there were dress-ups, there was kind of a kitchen, household area. It looked familiar, you know. And then came the idea that no, one should have learning centers. So then there was the science center, and there was the housekeeping dress-up center, and there was the building center, but everything was a center. And after a while, there was definite goals for every center of what the children should accomplish. So it wasn't just that the children played. Now they had to learn about certain things in each center. They had to build according to certain pictures, or it varied, but it became more and more conscious. And then the centers disappeared and just the conscious goals remained. And instead of having some guidelines for learning in kindergarten, we had what we call standards for learning, things that children were absolutely supposed to accomplish. And year by year, the standards got stricter, and the latest ones, what are called Common Core standards, were passed a few years ago. Our education is always done at the state level, not the national level. We don't like national education, which is just as well, because if you get it wrong, it's so hard to change it at the national level. At least at the state level, it's a little easier to change it. But with the Common Core standards, over 40 states agreed to use the same standards. So they did it voluntarily, a little incentive of money, but they did it voluntarily. And so in essence, these Common Core standards were going to be a national curriculum. And we fought very hard in the Alliance with many allies across the country to keep the kindergarten out of the Common Core, because we knew it would be bad news for young children. The idea with the Common Core standards was when children leave high school at age 18, they should be ready for college or the workplace, which is a perfectly reasonable goal. And so to accomplish that, here's what had to happen in 11th grade, 10th grade, 9th grade, 8th grade, boom, 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 down to kindergarten. And we said, no, kindergarten you need to build up according to developmental principles, not down according to what they should do at age 18, but we lost. So the kindergarten standards were in there. We got some of the worst ones out, but one remained that just drives me nuts. Well, a number of them remain that drive me nuts, but the main one was by the end of kindergarten, so this is now the children are 5 and a half, 6 years old, they should be able to read basic books with purpose and understanding. So this doesn't just mean identify a few words in a book, which most 5-year-olds, you know, there's some words they all like to know. This means it's a simple book, granted, but they need to be able to read and comprehend it. Well, you can imagine how many hours you have to spend to get 5-year-olds to that point. And many of them, if you spend enough time, can do it. However, in the end, they don't like to do it. And so you get children who can read but don't want to read, or for whom it's simply not possible yet developmentally. and then they're viewed as failures, and maybe they have to repeat kindergarten, and their parents think they're failures, and all kinds of things happen to perfectly lovely, normal children because they can't meet these standards. I have a friend whose grandson had gone to very good preschools, a lot of play, and then he went into a public kindergarten, and they had really tried to find a good kindergarten for him. But the first day he came home just exhausted. And the second day he didn't want to go to school. And the third day he locked himself in his bedroom, right? And wouldn't come out. Because the whole day was just oriented towards reading, writing, math, and other academic things. So that's what's happened in our kindergartens, and to get the children ready for that experience, more and more preschools for 4-year-olds and 3-year-olds are orienting towards academic instruction rather than play-based learning. So one of the things that we advocate for strongly in the Alliance for Childhood is what we call play-based experiential learning. So that means not just play all day, but content that teachers bring, but appropriate content. So in Waldorf kindergartens, that means we have circle time, we have story time, we have real work that we're doing with the children, there's painting. There's things that, as teachers, we prepare and do. We don't teach them the writing and the reading and the math, that can wait. But there are things we do, and that enriches their play. And so this combination of the content that the teacher brings and the child's own child-initiated play is, as we know, a very powerful combination. And we're finding that when we talk about it that way, people understand and they get it. If we just talk about play-based education, which is a term that's widely used, people don't like that because they think, oh, from 9 to 3, the children are just going to play. And actually, I wouldn't like that. Children get exhausted. They need, some time when they're kind of having a quieter time, when they're focusing in, when they're hearing stories and so on. So this combination tends to work. And I just want to show you an illustration. Maybe here. Do we have, yeah. Use a pretty color. So in this report that I mentioned, Crisis in the Kindergarten, we needed a way to explain this picture of education. And we came up with something which people have really liked. It's been in newspapers and different things. And it's what we call a continuum, where you have a range. So over here, let me use a white, I think it'll show better. Over here, you do have play, but play without any adult support, just play, which is fine for a while, but after a while, children tend to need a little something. They need an example of adults doing something real and so on. But at this extreme, you just have the kind of play people are afraid of. It gets very chaotic. Over here, you have instruction. And in the States, this can go very far in, teachers really, kindergarten teachers standing in front of children and telling them all sorts of things. Even, I was telling the students this week, for a while, what was very popular and still lingers on are scripted curricula, where teachers are given notebooks that they have to read from and follow the script with students, even 4- and 5-year-olds. It's just a horrible, horrible form of education. Why anyone would think it would work is beyond me, because it's never been shown to work, but that doesn't stop people from selling it and making a lot of money and convincing teachers that this is a good thing. But at any rate, this is what we call didactic instruction, where the teacher is really telling the children. But in between, you can have child-initiated play, but with some support from the adults. And that support, if we think of it in terms of a Waldorf kindergarten, the teacher is there if needed, and the teacher is doing real work that the children can imitate, and that helps them focus in on their play because the teachers are focused on their work. Of course, the teachers have their ears wide open to everything going on. The children don't think we're listening, but we are. But the teachers are there in a little bit on the side, but very much there. Combined with the teachers giving content, as I mentioned before, in the case of Waldorf education, that's the circle times that we offer and the story times, festival life, birthday stories, just the things we prepare that we bring to the children. So we don't do didactic instruction, but we do offer content. And I'm stressing this a little bit because so often, at least in the States, when we talk about Waldorf education, we talk about this part of the kindergarten. And people don't realize that really we offer a lot of content. It's just that we do appropriate content and we offer it in appropriate ways, but it's not that we just do nothing as teachers. And I think it's really important that we emphasize both, that people see the totality of what we're offering. It's a very rich, rich approach to education. So at any rate, we created this drawing and it had the parentheses, and a lot of people have reprinted this in their publications. You'll find, if you go to our website, allianceforchildhood.org/publications, I should write it all on the board, and I will later, take too much time. Crisis in the kindergarten, then you'll find this diagram in it, and you may find it useful at some point if you have to present to authorities or whoever what it is that you do. Okay, so one of the big attacks on play has come within early education, that play has been seriously reduced and plays in non-Waldorf kindergartens a very minor role in an all-day kindergarten. That's one of the ways it's been reduced. Another way is the technology in general, let's say at home, that when children are spending 2 to 4 hours a day with screens, that's 2 to 4 hours a day when they're not engaged in three-dimensional multisensory experiences. And when they're relying more and more on somebody else's creativity and not on their own. Because the people who produce the television shows or the video games and all are often highly creative people. But it's their creativity the children are now tuning into rather than developing their own creativity. And that's a big part of the problem. So, for example, a few years ago, the big computer firm IBM did a survey of 1,500 executives, CEOs of companies around the world. And they asked them, what's the number one thing you're looking for in an employee? And can you guess what they said? Creativity was the number one thing they wanted in their employees. At the same time, a study was done in the US using a test of creative thinking that's been around since the 1950s. It's considered a pretty good test of, they'll show you like a paper clip and ask you all the ways you could use a paper clip. It sort of measures odd thinking in people as a measure of creativity. So this test has been given millions of times, and a researcher looked at these results starting in the 1950s and found that the creativity levels went up in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and then around 1990, creativity levels started to go down in the US, and especially among children. And that's also around the time when the digital media started to come in more and more strongly, and play began to disappear more and more. So we don't know all the reasons why the creativity levels have been going down, but they have been going down at the very time when people most want creativity. This reliance on the digital world, rather than fostering children's own creativity, is another reason why, another factor that has influenced the reduction of play. And by the way, a little bit of an aside, last summer I was teaching in China, and you may know that Waldorf has just exploded in China. And that seems very odd because what we generally hear about Chinese education is how rigid and structured it is. But the Chinese very much want to change their education. And a high-ranking official was quoted in a US newspaper saying, we are known as a manufacturing country, but we want to be known as a creative country. And we have to change our education. And we will know that we're succeeding when our test scores go down. Americans found very interesting because we're always wanting our test scores to go up, and that's part of the problem. So China is not just looking to Waldorf, it's looking to all kinds of creative approaches to early education. I know a lot of people who are going over there to teach who are not Waldorf people, but who are very much supportive of play-based education. And, but with Waldorf, last summer, I did a course, a 2-week course on fairy tales and storytelling, and I had 125 students in my course. And a colleague from Australia had 125 students in her course. So in this training, there were 250 students learning about Waldorf early childhood education. They do 6 modules like that over a 2 or 3 year period. And 4 of the 6 places that do training have 125 students each, and the other 2 have 250 students each. Waldorf, I mean, it's just this huge explosion. And such enthusiasm. It was really quite wonderful to work with them. Enormous enthusiasm, enormous will forces. I told a nature story one day that I had used for an Advent garden and described what an Advent garden looked like, and the big spiral and so on. And afterwards, one of the women said, well, couldn't we do that here? And I'm thinking, you gotta be kidding, 250 people and a huge spiral, no. But I didn't say no. I just said, well, let me talk to Lee, who was the Chinese woman in charge of the course. And I actually didn't even talk to her for a couple days because I thought this was so ridiculous, right? So then I did say to her, one of the students asked about this. She says, oh, we could do that. And a few days later, we had the biggest double spiral I've ever seen in my life, and 250 people who walked it, carrying flowers and setting them down in the spiral. But just to say the kind of energy that is there is just unbelievable. So, trying to remember which of my big 4 I was on. With the digital, I think it was the digital world now, that it really is encroaching on children's play very strongly. And I imagine that you either already are feeling that or you will soon. Because everywhere I've gone, I've seen little children with their devices in their hands, and it looks very familiar, let's say. The other thing are organized activities for children, and I don't know how widespread this is yet in Finland, but it includes young children. Now our sports teams begin with 4 and 5-year-olds, and arts and music and things that are good for children, but there's so many of them, that it's not unusual to have a kindergarten child who's going to 2 or 3 or 4 different enrichment classes outside of school. And then that gets to be even more when they're a little bit older. And this is all over the world. I was in Africa, and a mother, put her hand up and said, well, my child, my 8-year-old or 10-year-old, I forgot now, she goes to 8 different classes every week. Do you think that's too many? You get asked the most interesting questions in this work. I said, well, does she seem stressed by this? And she thought for a minute. She said, well, you know, she's having eye problems, and the doctor said it was stress. I said, well, then I would reduce the number of activities that she has. Oh, but she likes them all. Yes, but it's too much for her, you know, or something like that. And people don't realize, they just feel these things are good for children, and the children often do like them. But it's the parent who has to have some wisdom about how much is enough. And this is, you know, something that one needs to speak out about with parents. And it's a challenge because, you know, you all work with parents. Many of you are parents. No parent likes to be told how to parent their child. Even when they ask you, you still have to go with enormous delicacy into that world. But still, as I used to say to the parents in my class, look, we each have a job to do. You see the child from the parent's perspective, I see the child from the teacher's perspective, and we need to just talk. You know, for the sake of the child, we need to share these different points of view and different insights that we have and see what we can do, especially a child who is under stress or has some special needs, really needs for parents and teachers to work together on their behalf. And usually it works. So all these activities also have reduced the amount of time that children have for play. I have distracted myself from my fourth point. Excuse me a minute. This is one that you might not have here. I hope you don't. And this is tremendous fear on the part of parents to let their children go out and play. We've always had, you know, a few abductions a year, you know, where somebody comes and takes a child off. And it's a terrible thing when that happens. I in no way want to make light of that. And it can lead to abuse, it can lead to death. It's terrible. But it does not happen often. But practically every parent in America lives in complete fear that this could happen at any moment to their child, and therefore they cannot let their children out of their sight even for a few minutes, because something terrible might happen. And that means that you don't let your child go out to play. You never say, just go out and play and come home for supper. Who knows what could happen to your child during those hours? It's a kind of hysteria that's taken over the country. And usually it's said that the reason is that media plays up each of these things so much. So it used to be maybe something terrible happened in your community, and 20 years later maybe something else terrible happened, and in between everything was fine. But now everything that happens anywhere in the country comes into your living room with enormous, you know, the music and the energy behind these reports. You just, as a parent, feel under attack all the time, and that you must protect your child. And there's now a counter movement going on called free-range kids, like free-range chickens, you know. We have free-range kids. But it's a good movement and a hilarious book written by the author. I'll put her name here. She has a website and blogs every day. Lenore Skenazy is her name. And, you know, what she's really doing is encouraging parents to not feel like the worst possible things are going to happen at any given moment. What she calls worst first thinking. But to, you know, to be reasonable about it. Our crime rates in the States are way down, back to where they were in the 1960s or so. It's become a much safer country to be in than it used to be, despite the guns and the shootings that you hear about. But in general, it's much safer for children to be out playing than it used to be. And, you know, it's hard to counter fear. Fear is a tough one. And when we started in the Alliance to work on restoring play, and we looked at all these factors, so, you know, the media and the outdoor, the organized activities and the education problems, and the fear, we realized fear was going to be the toughest one to address, because it's not rational. The others you can kind of talk about, and people get it, and they're prepared to make changes, but fear comes from this unconscious place very often. And so one of the things we did, and I'm going to pause after this example, but we met a play worker from England. And play workers are people who are very knowledgeable about play. There's specialized trainings for play workers in the UK, where they work with children of all ages, right up into teenage years. They often are at adventure playgrounds or other public sites. And they don't ever direct the children's play. Their goal is really to be there supporting children's play. So I was very drawn to this idea because it was like being a Waldorf kindergarten teacher, but working with all ages outside of school, in play environments. And I also realized that if you had play workers present, parents could relax more and let the children play again. So we've done a lot in the Alliance to feature play work and that approach. And it's catching on now in the US. And there is an online training, actually, that people around the world can do. And we have a growing number of adventure playgrounds where children really are free to play in very significant ways. I visited a couple programs this summer, and I'm working on a book with about 20 different examples of some of these new play ventures that are going on across the country. That should be out in a couple months. So there are ways to counter play, and we do see it beginning to return in the US. But if you still have play here, which I hope you do everything you can to protect it, because it's a lot easier to protect it and keep it than it is to bring it back when it's vanished. But even when it's under threat, it's possible to restore play. In schools, in parks, at homes, work on the media questions and all of that. It's difficult. Believe me, I know it's difficult, but it is not impossible. So that's kind of my overall message about play in the world today. And I want to take a break now and see, I'm hoping that you'll have some contributions or questions. I would love to know more about what you're facing here in Finland. I feel like I've been in this beautiful protected space now this week. I want to hear about the wider world in Finland.